Today I'll be taking the story Hagar, A Story of Woman and Water by Sarah Joseph. Now, this particular story or an extract, it comes from the second chapter of Sarah Joseph's novel Gift in Green. And the basic theme of the story is of water as a fundamental giver and preserver of life. Now, let me introduce to you the author. She's very famous, and I know most of you you've heard about her. Sarah Joseph. She is a leading feminist writer in Malayalam. She is also the founder of Manushi. It is an organization for women thinkers. She served as a professor of Malayalam at Sanskrit College, Patambi, and is a well-known social worker. Her literary career began early as a poet, and if you talk about her fame, her famous fictions, her famous fictional outputs such as short stories and novels includes works like Papatara, Kadinte Sangeetham, Nanma Thilmagalode Vriksham, Alayile Penmakkal, etc. And it is this novel, Adi, which is translated as Gift in Green that we need to pay special attention to. Now, she has always she's uh, received many awards, including the Kendra Sahitya Academy Award, the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, as well as the Vailar Award for Alahure Penmakkal. So she's pretty famous, and it is the kind of stories that she tells that makes her who she is today. Very unique, and she always focuses on either ecological factors or women. Now, here in this story, what is important is the idea of water. So it is almost like a mother, because here you find water becomes a sort of a giver of life and preserver of life. So it is the analogy which is really interesting. So it is a ritual storyteller visiting a community in Adi, narrates this story of Hagar and Ismail and their miraculous survival in the hostile desert when Abraham had abandoned them. The mysterious appearance of a bird reveals a water spring that becomes the elixir of life for her and for the settlement that eventually comes up around the lake that forms a sort of a spring. And from there, you have a new civilization that basically comes about. Now, what the story basically underscores is that we take nature and its gift of water for granted, and that if one is to have life and prosperity, water must be valued. So, this story basically focuses on the importance of water and how we should not take water to be granted. It is also a story about a woman's endurance and boundless energy. According to the author, the novel was inspired by the myths and ethos of the island municipalities of uh, Valanthakad in Kerala. Now, if you look at the story, if you look at the background, you understand that Hagar was the Egyptian slave of Sarah, and Sarah was Abraham's wife. Now, when Abraham and Sarah they fail to have a child, you find Sarah offers her slave, her handmaid Hagar, to her husband so that he can have a child. And when Sarah herself she gives birth to a son, that is when things change. She becomes quite jealous and she insists that Hagar and her son Ismail should be banished. And you find God appears before Abraham and tells him to abandon Hagar, and that Ishmael and his children will become a new race and a new nation. They'll create a new nation altogether, and that his line will proceed through Sarah's son Isaac. And you find immediately listening to this direction, God's direction, Abraham decides to abandon Hagar and his firstborn child, his firstborn son Ishmael. Now, that is the background of the context of the story. Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, that day waking her and her son earlier than usual, her husband thrust into her hands a few loaves of bread, a small quantity of dates, and a goatskin full of water. Follow me, take your son too. He mounted his camel, he stepped out, walked ahead, and led them to the wilderness where the mountains were bare and the landscape bore thorns and thistles. A sandstorm raged continually. Leaving them there, he turned and began to walk away. Are you leaving me here forever? She cried out in panic. He did not turn back. Why do you abandon your child and me in this terrible, lonely wilderness? He did not stop. What wrong have I done? Tell me that at least. Don't I have a right to know? Hagar screamed after him, but received no reply. She could only see his red robe lifting and fluttering in the desert wind. Heartbroken, she fell to the ground and lay prostrate. Except for a few dates and a half full water skin, I have nothing. The sun spits fire on me and my child. I am singed within and without. The burning sand roasts my feet as though I am standing on a red hot pan. You, who walk away from me, won't you tell me how I am to take care of your firstborn? Beyond the mountain, the last glimpse of his red robe was fading out of sight. Hagar mustered all her strength and yelled at the top of her voice, Did your God order you to do this? Atop the mountain, he stopped and turned back. Yes, this is the will of God. So you find Hagar and her little baby Ishmael, they're both cast out. One fine day, without any warning, you find Abraham basically hands them loaves of bread, a little bit of, a small quantity of dates, and just a goat skin full of water. And he takes them to the mountain where there is actually a sandstorm, and he abandons them there. And she pleads and she screams and she asks him as to what fault, what crime they have committed, and whether it is his God that has actually asked him to do the same. And then you find Abraham confirms and says, Yes, it is the will of my God, and that is why I'm abandoning you. So you find, a sort of indifference. You find Abraham sounds and seems quite indifferent to the plight of his wife, if not his wife, then mother of his firstborn son. So he very cruelly abandons Hagar and his newborn, his firstborn son, in the desert while there is a sandstorm. And you find Hagar is hurt, she's angry, she's confused. And Hagar asks him, The God who led me to your bed, it is your God who actually, asked you to um, have a child with me. Is it the same God who's asked you to abandon me and your child? So now she questions him and then she says, And will the river of life to flow? Won't you for life's sake to that God listen? Or was the will of God to you then as now an alibi and little else for your impotence as a man? So if she's basically accusing him here, she's asking him whether are you using God and God's will as an excuse for your own impotence, or is it really God who actually asked you to have a child? Or was it just an excuse? Was it the same God? who asked you to, come together with me? Was it the same God who asked you to leave me? Or is this idea of a God who did all this, was it simply an excuse? Or was the will of God to you then as now an alibi, an excuse, a justification for what you lacked? That is your impotence as a man. So she's so angry that she even insults him. Clasping the baby to her bosom, she stood watching him as he descended the other side of the hill and disappeared out of sight. So, without a care for his son or for the woman, he, he lived, he abandons them. To hide herself from the heavy sandstorm that beat upon her, she sank to the ground, nestling the baby under her. So she cuddles the baby under her, and she sinks to the ground, and she basically curls and she protects her baby under her. When the gale subsided, that is when the storm, it calmed down, the baby began to scream in terror on seeing her disheveled, her face, her hair, and the headcloth all covered with sand. And once the storm came to an end, the baby opened its eye and began to scream out in terror because it could not recognize its mother. Because now Hagar looked very different. Her face, her hair, her head, everything was covered with sand. She must have looked quite terrible for the child. Her tears had dried up, as also the milk in her breast. Dehydrated, her blood had begun to thicken. Every stream within her that had flowed ceaselessly, that is continuously, like the unending mercies of God, was drying up too. So it was so hot, it was parching hot, it was so hot that she could feel that her blood was beginning to thicken. She was feeling dehydrated, and all that water within her, it was drying up. Hungry, Ishmael began to cry. My son, before this blazing heat dries up my breast, drink to the last drop. So now she knows that their life is in danger, but her son is hungry. So she tells her son, "You better drink up all the milk before even that dries up." She cuddled the baby to her bosom. Ismail's hunger was not assuaged, it was not relieved. He was still feeling thirsty and hungry. He stared at her in terror. Late into the night, hungry and weak, he cried himself to sleep. So he did not get enough milk, and he kept crying because he was hungry, and he ended up crying himself to sleep. Who would abide with her through the terror of that lonely night? So she kept wondering, who's going to uh, give her company through this period, to this rough patch of her life, in that scary wilderness that filled her with fear. Who would comfort her? Her body trembled with exhaustion, and her mind quivered with anxiety. The sky above, her only ceiling, all around her the wilderness, a vast, wall-less mansion that afforded neither provision nor protection. So you find her mind and body was affected. She was exhausted, and she was filled with fear and anxiety. She was so scared because she was stuck here in the desert. There was just wilderness all around. She had nobody to comfort her. And then she looked at the sky. That was the only ceiling. There was no other protection. There was no other shelter for her. And then she looked all around. That entire desert seemed like a mansion. It was a mansion without a wall because it was never ending. And this wall or this mansion or the sky, which was her ceiling, did not protect her, did not give her any kind of shelter. The mercy of your father's God is spreading blankets of darkness on the walls of the horizon. To keep us warm, my son, she tried to comfort the baby whose jaws were chattering in the biting cold of the night. So in the afternoon, it was very hot. If you know about the desert, the climate is extremely different. In the morning, it is extremely hot, and in the night, you have the other extreme. That is, it becomes extremely cold. So here you find Hagar's attempt to console her baby, trying to comfort her baby by saying that um, this horizon, this sky, the night sky is like a blanket, and this is something that the God has given us. God has given us this night sky. It's like a blanket, and she says this to comfort her child, but you find her child is already feeling really cold because the baby's jaws were chattering in the biting cold of the night. Far into the night, a piercing wind continued to blow. The sand that glowed like coals of fire in the day hardened into shards of ice at night. So here we're talking about extreme climates. Now into the night you find the sand that glowed like coals of fire. So in the morning the sand was like fire. It was like coals of fire. It was so hot. It nearly singed. It nearly burned them. And that very same sand towards the fag end of the day had turned into shards, pieces of ice at night. So here again, you get to understand the climate, the harsh climate in the desert. Now within the folds of her robe, against the warmth of her bosom, Hagar hid her son. So the only way she could protect her son was to clasp him, cuddle him against her bosom. In the darkness of this terrible night, wintry winds howl and needle me. Oh, open not your cavernous mouth. Cavernous here means vast, large, or immense. So here it is almost like a prayer. She hides the sun and she's basically praying out to um, nature out. She tells the the darkness, the night, the nature out there. She tells the winds not to, not to open their mouth and swallow her son. You hungry desert loneliness. So here it's almost like a prayer, asking the desert not to, not to harm her son. Though tortured by thirst, she did not so much as moisten her lips with a drop of water on which she knew hinged the hope of her son's survival in the burning heat of the following day. So you find she did not even bring out her tongue to, moisten her lips because she knew that whatever water she had in her body, she had to preserve it for her son. She knew her son's life depended on her son, her son's survival. So she had to preserve every single drop of water she had in her body. Despite the hunger that tormented her, she did not touch even one of the few remaining dates. So she refused food because she wanted to keep all that for her son. She did not have anything that she brought along with her, not the bread loaf, not the dates, not even water. The feeble light of the stars only deepened the loneliness of the wilderness. Now and then, like long, deep sighs, the dust storms continued to blow and buffet her. The short night came to an end somehow. The long day began. Having blazed as much fire as it could, the sun hid himself behind the sand dunes to the west. For a while, the sand remained like cinders of fire. So you find after a short night, cold, bitter night, there was the long day. And once again it was very hot, the fire blazing, the sun finally hid himself behind the west. And then again it was the next night. And again it was biting cold. The water ran out. Remember they only brought along with them one goat skin of water. Now that water ran out. Racked with thirst, her son began to scream and howl. Now the small baby was feeling the hunger, and he had started to cry. Gradually his voice became weaker. It petered out into feeble cry. It faded. It petered, the cry faded into a small, feeble kind of a cry, like the choky key of a bird whose neck is being wrung. Just like you would, strangle a bird, and just before the bird would die, it would, the cry of the bird would decrease, or it would subside or fade out. Similarly, the voice of our son too became very feeble. Now, this is a sign that he is not healthy anymore and that he may die. She squeezed out the last remaining drops from the water skin and moistened the parched lips of the baby. He cried all the more. Would it be her son first, or would it be she? Who would be the first to die? Hagar shuddered at the thought of having to dig a pit with her bare hands to bury him in the sand and then wandering about in the wilderness all alone. But what if she were to die first? That terrified her even more. How could this be the will of God? Hagar trembled at the thought of her child crying in terror as he helplessly watched the vultures feasting on her dead body or crawling in the burning sand in search of her. No, no, it could not be. There had to be something far greater. Now Hagar was contemplating death. She was thinking, what if my son died? I would have to dig a hole for him and I would have to bury him in the hole. And she could not bear the thought of her son dying before her. And then she thought of the other alternative. She thought of the alternative. That is, what if she were to die first before him? What would happen to the child? She could imagine her child crying in terror, watching the vultures eat her up, eat or feed on her dead body, and her son crawling in the sand searching for her, not knowing that the mother had died. So both these alternatives seem to be terrible for her. No, no, she says, there has to be something greater. There has to be some way out of this. This cannot be the end, she thought. Hagar got up. The God of the one who disowned was also the God of the one disowned. She had to seek and find the wellspring of life. So suddenly she gets courage. She decides that she has to fight. She has to find water. Hagar began to wander about, struggling against the creeping hopelessness that tormented her. She crawled up and down the dunes, collapsing to the ground every now and then, exhausted. The whimpers of the bay continued to lick her heart like tongues of fire. She pleaded to the sun blazing mercilessly, to the gale blowing, deaf to the cry for compassion and justice, to the endless stretch of sand that pricked fire into her exhausted, staggering feet. Show a little mercy, give me a little more time, be kind. So you find Hagar begins to wander. She starts struggling, she starts crawling up and down the dune. She's in search of water. And then she begins to beg the sun not to blaze so mercilessly. She begins to look at the gale that is blowing, the wind, and then she cries for compassion. And then she cries, she says, show me a little mercy, give me a little more time, she says, be kind. In truth, my child, a woman it was who cast you into the plastic will of your father's enigmatic God. So now she's talking about Abraham's first wife, and says it is another woman who actually made me be with your father, and she was the same woman who cast you out. Now that God now wills, he says, to discard you into a dusty death in this waterless wilderness. As a woman, it is not in me, my child, in God's name to let you die. With the last drop of my ebbing strength, strength of body, mind, and soul, for your life I will fight and keep faith. You must survive, and survive you shall. The firstborn of the dispossessed, the giver of life, will water give, for God is life, and life water. So now she accuses another woman for actually uh, harming her and her son. And then she talks about this God of your father, who actually asked him to abandon you. And then she says, this waterless wilderness. And she says, as a woman, I cannot let you die. In the name of God, I cannot let you die because after all, I am a mother. And then she says, with the last drop of my ebbing strength, I will fight for your life, and I will keep fighting for your life till the very end. And then she says, the giver of life will water give. So God will give water because God is life and life is water. So now she utters this truth, and then she begins to, continue her search for water. Afternoon, Ishmael suddenly became unusually still. Thinking him dead, she laid him by a bush and stood nearby, numb and motionless. Her heart-broken cry, welling up from deep within, died as though ripped in the middle. So suddenly, by afternoon, Ishmael had become very quiet. It looked as if he was dead, and you find Hagar too realizes, or she thinks that he's dead, and she lays him next to a small bush, and then she stands there and she's exhausted. She cannot react. She's become quite numb and motionless, and then she begins to cry, and this cry comes from deep within, as if someone had uh, cut her open in the middle. And then she hears someone calling her by her name. Did she hear someone call her by name? Who is it? Is anybody out there? Who are you to have come to my help? It was the voice of her own desperate uh, bewilderment that she had heard. The wilderness, frighteningly vast and lonely, was all there was. In the depths of sorrow and despair, she lay prostrate, covering her baby. At once she heard a baby whimpering, and again someone calling her by her name. She grabbed the baby from the sand and dashed here and there, seeking the voice that had called her. Could it have been only the clamor of her own heart's desperate hope, the fragrance of whose wind wafted mercy was it that enveloped her? Who could it be, my God, in this terrifying solitude? Willing all her strength to her legs, Hagar groped and wandered about in the wilderness. Who? Where? Then, as in a dream, she chanced upon the source of the sound. So now she actually thought her child was dead, and she places the child right next to a bush, and she stands there numb and motionless, unable to react. And then slowly, uh, you know, there is this heartbroken cry that seems to come from deep within her. And at the same time, she hears somebody calling out her name, Hagar. And then she wonders, who could it be? Who could be out here in this wilderness? And then she wonders whether it is her own voice. It is her desperation that she hears. Because after all, there could be nobody in this wilderness. And then, because she's filled with sorrow, she comes close to her child. She covers her baby, and she hears her baby whimpering again. And she's so happy that the child is alive. She grabs the baby from the sand, and then she begins to, run around seeking the source of the voice that seems to be calling out to her. She wonders whether this noise is her actually real, or whether it is her heart's hope, whether it is hope that is creating this sound, or whether there is actually that sound. She's not very sure whether it is an illusion, it is her fancy. So the fragrance of whose wind wafted mercy was it that enveloped her. Who could it be, my God, in this terrifying solitude? And then you find Hagar begins to wander and grope, and she's seeking, she's searching for the source, for the sound. And then finally she she sees she sees the source of the sound, and you find it is a bird, a mysterious bird near the bush, flaying the ground with its wings. So right next to one bush she sees a bird, a very strange sort of a bird. And what is this bird doing? It is beating the ground with its wings. And that sound of this bird beating the ground with its wings is making the sound hugger, hugger, hugger. And that is a sound she had heard. It was not somebody calling out to her, but rather it was this bird. Its downy feathers, its soft velvety feathers lay scattered all around. So around this bush she could see the bird's feathers scattered all around, and there was blood. Blood speckled its wings. So you find the blood was covered. There were patches of blood on its wings, but heedless. The bird did not pay any attention to its own pain, its agony. It continued to thrash about, it continued to beat about, determined to knock the earth open. So the bird did not pay attention to its pain, to the blood, but rather it kept hitting at the earth. It was trying to open up the earth. Hagar stood transfixed, because this is one amazing sight. She stood there transfixed. She was hypnotized. It was, she was shocked. She was just looking at the bird. She could not do much as a spring gushed forth from the earth like water squirting from the eyes of a pierced coconut. So when you pierce coconut, we are all familiar with it. When you cut open coconut or you pierce a coconut with a knife, the water would gush out like a spring or like a fountain. Similarly, this bird kept beating the earth, and suddenly there was a burst of water or spring that came out from that earth, and water squirted from this earth. Incredulously, she stood and watched the bird drinking water ravenously. So greedily, she watched this bird drinking water, dipping again and again in the pool around the spring, and juddering, vibrating its wings in joyful celebration. So for a long second, she just stood there. For quite some time, she was so shocked that she could not do much. She just stood there watching this bird drinking greedily, dipping again and again in the pool. She was just she's watching this bird in amazement. And then suddenly, in a flash, she comes to her senses. Hagar ran back, screaming, scooped up her son, flew to the spring, and immersed her son in the water. Trembling, she poured a palmful into his mouth, immersed him in. So now she discovers this bird, and she, watches this bird dipping into the pool around the spring. It is juddering its wings in joyful celebration. Now you find Hagar, she stands shell shocked watching this bird, and then after a second, she's able to come out of this um, hypnotic state, and then she runs back, screams, and then she scoops her son, flew to the spring, and then she immersed her son in the water. Trembling, she poured a palmful into his mouth and immersed him in the pool again and again. The flow of water continued undiminished, the source spouting more and more fresh water. Hagar soaked herself in the stream until in her breast she knew the miracle of water turning into milk. She settled on the banks of a small lake that lay between the barren hills and the thorny bushes. It was a bird near the water spring. She remembered gratefully that had led her like the wing beat of life itself to this water source in the desert. She felt humbled by the ways of God. Hearing of the water source, nomads and desert tribes came in search. So you find she realizes she dips her son, and then later on she um, soaks herself in the stream, and then she understands the miracle of water. She understands or realizes the true value of water. And then you find she decides to settle down on the banks of a small lake that lay between the barren hills and the thorny bushes. And she remembers very gratefully that it was actually a bird that had led her here to the source of life, that is water. And she felt humbled by the ways of God. Hearing of the water source, Hearing of the water source, nomads and desert tribes, they all came in search. They saw the lake, and they saw sitting on its banks a woman with a baby in her lap. So very soon people in the desert, they came to hear about this miracle, and they all came and they found her with her son. May we too drink from this? The nomads asked her. Hagar nodded assent. And settle down near the banks? The tribes asked. Hagar could understand the thirst of a people, the infinite value of water, and the secret of life scripted, embedded into it. She said, I have no objection, but you must know that water is life itself. I shall be the caretaker of this water, guard it, and mother it for the sake of my child and for the sake of the children yet to be born. So you find Hagar taking on a new role here. She decides to become a sort of a caretaker for the spring that emerged. She decides to be a sort of a mother to this water, as she decides to guard it because now she has understood the value of water. And she says that she will be here to take care of this water, not just for her child, but for all the children who will who are yet to be born. This water you shall have, but only if you agree to a covenant. So she allows the tribes to settle down to use this water, but only on a condition. They have to come to some kind of an agreement. And she asks them to agree to a covenant. I insist on this, not in a spirit of power or of ownership, but in the name of life. So she says she does not have any, uh, hidden agenda behind it. It is not like she's trying to show her power of ownership, but it is because she says she knows the value of water. She says, to me, the value of the first drop of water is the value of the life of my firstborn. It for her, for Hagar, that water was what gave life to her son. It was what stopped her son from dying. So she says, I know the value of water, and that is why you need to agree to this covenant. You stand excited, seeing an ample source of fresh water here before you, but you know nothing of the value or the meaning of that first drop of water. It coolness, its coolness that flowed into my soul like the assurance of life itself. Others may not know the first drop of water, but I do, and I can't forget what it means. Not a drop of water shall be wasted. I won't allow it. So she says, you're all standing here, you're excited because you see water. You see ample source of water here. For you, it is just water. But for me, it is much more than that because I know the value of that first drop of water. Water that gave life not just to my son, but it flowed into my soul and assured me life. So I know the value of the first drop of water, and I will not allow even a drop of water to be wasted. Now, this is what Hagar says, I will not allow it. The nomads agreed. They sensed her earnestness and they were desperate for water. We acknowledge you as the protector and caretaker of the water. We will gather food for you. Only give us the water we need. That day, the desert witnessed the birth of a water covenant. The nomads fed her and the child. They in turn bathed and drank water to the heart's content. With the plentiful water, Hagar knew they could cultivate vegetables near the lake. Working together, they reaped a joyous harvest hatched festivals. In due course, a people, that is, a new race, came into being. So you find it is from this agreement, this covenant, that there came about race, a new race of people. And you find the nomads agreed to this covenant, this agreement, and they drank water. The nomads fed her and the child. They drank water. Very soon, with this water, they cultivated vegetables near the lake, and very soon they came together as a race of people. And you find this crops led to harvest, and harvest led to festivals, and soon a new race of people came into existence. And you find now this is how a new race came into existence. Now it is believed that Muslims have actually descended from Ishmael, and therefore Hagar is of great value, and she's held in high esteem by this Islamic community. So that is the end of this chapter. It is a very touching story. It tells you about, it deals with main themes, that is of water, importance of water,